Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar today. My name is Johanna. I'm from the UN Innovation Network. And thank you for joining us on this webinar on humane technologies today. So just a few words up front. We're surrounded by more and more technologies in our daily lives. And chances are today you've already interacted with several AI-enabled platforms and tools. Maybe you've used some chatbots. A few of us may have played around with generative AI solutions like the ChatGPT that is making the headlines these days. I'm quite amazed what technology can do. Maybe you are too. And it's always important to take a step back and think like such powerful technology has the potential to do incredible good, but it can also exacerbate the challenges that we're seeing as a global community today. And if not used in the right way, we're creating new ones on top of the ones we're already facing. So I think it's fundamental to ask the question how we can use technology for good. And this is precisely what we want to do in this webinar today. We've invited colleagues from the Center for Humane Technologies to help us understand what humane technologies are and how we can work towards developing them. And we'll also be talking about a course on foundations of humane technologies, which we invite you to take all together as a learning cohort with potentially additional touch points with the Center for Humane Technologies throughout the way. But before I hand over to our speaker for the day, I'd briefly like to give the floor to our colleague Nitima, who's the learning designer for UNDP's Chief Digital Office, and she inspired this webinar today. Nitima, you've taken the course. What were your impressions and takeaways?
Yeah, thank you very much, Joanna, for accepting to host this webinar and putting with me the Discord for the foundation course for the Center for Human Tech. So, you know, I work for the Chief Digital Office, and we've set this vision that we want to create a world in which digital is an empowering force for the people and the planet. And as you said, it's incredible to recognize the potential for technology to do good, but I think it's equally important to see the risk and potential harm that technology can have on the people and the planet. And so I've done the course, and I think it's especially relevant for development and humanitarian context, because we work in contexts that are highly sensitive and with population at risk. And at the same time, because we are at the UN, we also have the opportunity to set an example and the best practice on how to build human right-based technology. And I think this course really gives the framework actually to build technology that can serve the people and the planet, even if you're not a technologist. So I would really encourage anybody to take the course. I actually think it's a must. I actually think the next couple of years are going to be really critical in framing how technology and digital will shape our world. So yeah, thank you for putting the webinar together, and thank you, Randy, for waking up so early to present us the course and the content that you've been building with the Center for Human Tech. And personally, I'm quite a fan. I think it's an amazing work. So yeah, really happy to be here. Thanks.
Thanks, Nitima, appreciate it. So we have one fan. Randy will be hoping to create more fans by the end of the webinar. Just a quick note to everyone before I finally introduce you to Randy. Randy, I want to say we're obviously going to make time for question and answers at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can see other people's questions. You can vote on them. You can help us prioritize. And because it tends to be the most popular question, yes, we are recording the webinar. Yes, we're making the slides available. You will find them in our webinar library, and we'll also email them to you. And with that, enough from our side, really. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Randy Fernando. Randy is the co-founder of the Center for Humane Technology, who are the makers and the brains behind the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, and behind the podcast, Your Undivided Attention. If you haven't seen or listened to either, I recommend both. I've seen them, I've listened to them, very, very interesting content. And of course, they are the makers behind the course on humane technology, which we're going to discuss today. Randy, you're joining us from the San Francisco Bay Area. Thank you for getting up so early. We really appreciate it. Over to you, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nitima and Johanna. Yeah, sorry, my voice is a little weird today, so I'll do my best. I think it'll be okay. Yeah, let's see if I can see a few people. Oh, it's a webinar, right? So I can't. Okay, no worries. Yeah, let me just hide this then. Okay. So, yeah, how do we handle this situation, right? There's all this technology coming. Every day there's a new thing, right? And of course, with the AI revolution, there's a lot more to consider than I'd say ever before. So what I'm going to try to do today is to share some ideas and some principles from the course um, that apply to lots of different technologies, including social media, AI, virtual reality, but even other fields, right? Like say genetic engineering, right? These principles are fairly universal. And what I find is that having a good, like a principled mindset helps you to navigate a lot of weird things as they come up, right? Unknowns, more skillfully. So, as we mentioned, the course is here, humanetech.com/course. I highly encourage you to check it out. We can talk more about that at the end. There are 3 ways to take the course, so you can see whichever format works for you. Some people like to have written content that they can scan, right, with the pictures. Some people like this kind of thing, which is like a webinar, you know, with the talking head. And then there's slides. If you want to just flip through the slide version, you can do that as well. There's a lot more words on those slides, so you can just read through them. So whatever you like. We also have a certificate available. If you finish all of the reflections in the course, you'll get a certificate. So if that's valuable to you, just remember to do that. But the instructions are everywhere. If you just enroll in the course, you'll see when you log in, all these options are shown to you and you can just choose whatever you like. Okay. Oh, right. Yeah. Really quick intro about myself. So basically my background is in programming and meditation and social impact. I was at NVIDIA for 7 years doing computer graphics stuff. Then I helped to run an organization called Mindful Schools that was teaching meditation skills to educators, and then the educators were teaching that to kids at scale. And then more recently, I co-founded Center for Humane Technology with Tristan Harris and Asa Raskin. And I think Johanna said all of the different highlights, so I'll just keep moving. Okay, so first we will step back and kind of take a look at the world. This is something that the UN, I think, does all the time. This is less familiar for some of the other audiences we present to, so please bear with me. I'll just go really quickly through this. I'm sure you're all aware of these trends, right? Like we have access to longer lifespans, right? We're generally doing better than we ever have in terms of life expectancy. Infant mortality is down. We have access to food, clothing, shelter, a lot of nice things for many people. Less people are in extreme poverty than ever. We're more connected than we've ever been, right? There's more people on the internet. And also more people have access to information and artificial intelligence, which you can really think of as cognitive power, right? Just like thinking power. And it's not just knowledge, right? It's sort of the ability to combine concepts in cognitively useful ways. And one important thing to note here is the change in slope of advancement, right? So many of you may have heard of Moore's law, right? Doubling every 18 months. This was really about transistor size, right? And packing more and more transistors into an area. Very expensive, a lot of research involved, and you need, you know, hardware like lithography machines that etch these chips. And yet it's still amazing, right? 2x every 18 months. We've never built anything like that in our history. And then now with AI, we're advancing kind of 10x every year. And the reason for that is that it's dependent on it's not dependent on these like hardware processes, but more like clustering groups of computers together in smart ways. And we're actually quite good at that. So we can scale that up much, much faster. So all of these advances have costs, right? So now all of the sort of the comforts that we have for more people also mean we have 1.5 billion air conditioners and cars and cows. And when you add all that up, of course, you get CO2 emissions, right? Which has other impacts like extreme weather, right? Which we are all feeling in different ways all over the world. So, and then of course, when these things happen, right, the economic damage starts to go up exponentially because the amount of energy stored in the air, right, it goes up exponentially with the temperature change. And so this is a huge problem, right, as we all know. And also all of these things get distributed unequally, right? All of the harms, the damages get distributed unequally. And this happens all the time with basically every technology. Our connectedness is amazing, but also it's also led us to having these sort of billion-person social media networks, outrage, division, addiction, right? Influencer worship, like the wrong values. All of these things have happened. And if you haven't seen The Social Dilemma, it's been watched by 100 million people plus, right, around the world. It's really helpful. It's a great tool. It's on Netflix, to get people to align around these kinds of harms and kind of see how what many people think of as just addiction actually leads to a whole wide range of downstream harms. And then also we live in this world, right? So when we have artificial intelligence, we can synthesize imagery. We don't know what's real. We don't know what's fake. And then there's all these impacts on unemployment, right? On jobs. And we haven't even begun to see, right, the actual impacts. But if you understand the technology, the effects are going to be profound. And I think far more severe than basically, I mean, all of the forecasts I've seen, because especially the older forecasts were not accounting for these newer types of technologies, right? The large language models being so successful. And a lot of this is already, like a lot of what you hear is based on ChatGPT, which is based on GPT 3.5, right? 3 and 3.5, which is kind of old tech compared to, right, the new technology GPT-4, and all the extra training and all the extra parameters and all the extra ability that the new models have. So, and I remember that stuff is advancing kind of like 10x per year. So we can expect some quite profound shifts in jobs and companies, and which ones rise and which ones fall. And it's going to be, I think, quite a crazy time, which is all the more reason why we have to have good principles for thinking through it. On top of that, right, so we can do deep fakes of world leaders, right? This great video where they're all singing, right? Imagine together, all deep faked, right? You can make them say what you want, and it looks good. You can synthesize your own humans that look great. And again, this is old technology. This screenshot is from 2021. And they speak and they blink and they do everything realistically. You can tie all that together. And then you can sort of tap into our innate curiosity, right? If someone says, hey, upload your picture and I'll show you how you look when you're older. A lot of us will do that, right? Because we're curious. We just have this human nature that we want to know, wow, like, I wonder what I would look like. But that can also mean that our information can be taken, right, and archived and analyzed very, very easily. This is just a simple example. We can also produce trustworthy faces, right? Synthetic faces on demand. I believe all the S's in this picture are synthetic. So when you put all these technologies together, right, the ability to synthesize text, to synthesize video, right, the 3D models, or actually deepfakes, either one, and synthetic audio, right? So now I just saw there's another paper that came out late in 2022. It synthesizes voice at high quality with just 3 seconds of source audio, which is really amazing. And the results are really good. Like you listen to that and you don't need to do 3 seconds. You can do more than that, right? So imagine when you combine all that, someone calls you, like even if you get a prank call and you say 3 seconds in response to the prank call, and that data is then archived and analyzed, now your voice can be synthesized with some level of fidelity. So you can see there's some really, really obvious ways that this stuff can go badly. And at the same time, right, there's all this access. So it's kind of a complicated situation. It's kind of like this, right? And I know all of you are very keenly tuned into this, more than a lot of, let's say, most technologists. I won't repeat all of these, but you know, right, there's this vast, very poorly distributed resources, right? Whether it's money, whether it's food, whether it's medical care, whether it's shelter, we're not doing this very well. So it really is, it's a time of great progress and peril. And again, you all know this very well. So how do we navigate this, right? How, when you have all these nuances and you're trying to figure out what to do, Well, there's a few things. So, first of all, we have to have nuanced thinking, right? We have to be able to hold a bunch of different realities at once. We have to look at what the dominant trends are. And because that's what's driving, right? We may want one thing to be true, but if a dominant trend is sort of driving everything, we have to see those trends and account for them in our work. And then another really important thing is getting clear on what thriving entails. And here by thriving, you can use words like flourishing, you can use words like happiness. It's kind of like, why do we do everything we do? So we'll talk about that. So first is this idea of nuanced thinking, right? So getting out of the black and white thinking and saying, well, actually multiple realities happen at the same time. So again, the poverty example, but at the same time, right? So there's progress on one front, but on the other front, we have technology that's accelerating massive inequalities. And guess what? I mean, of course, this is going to get much worse as we unleash artificial intelligence, because there's just the power and capability is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. So the people who control these technologies are going to have a very disproportionate access, and a lot of other people, like the vast majority of people, will suddenly not have skills that are worthwhile, that aren't already automated, right? So Yuval Harari calls this the useless class, right? This is what's going to happen, and we have to understand these trends and try and like get in front of them. It could be a world where people have a lot more free time and we do wise things with our technologies, but when it's tied to this capitalist machine, that often doesn't go that way, as you probably know. We like to use this quote because this quote really summarizes the dominant trend, like what is going on. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. This is our problem. And Dr. E.O. Wilson, who passed away, I think it was last year, or the year before, really summarized this beautifully. I think this just captures the situation. Technology is the greatest accelerator we've ever built, and I'm not sure anyone's going to debate that. But the question is, what ideas are being accelerated, and how? So here are some of the ideas, right, that are being accelerated. What are the ideas of the prevailing socioeconomic systems in most of the world? At least, especially the ones who are sort of driving like a lot of the technology and like GDP and driving competition. We have to understand, right, the mindsets and paradigms, right, the ways of thinking that give rise to the systems that kind of end up putting their arms around us and all of our behaviors and all of our technology. So here are some examples, right? Growth is good. One can own land. Nature is here to serve us. People are rational. These are some of the ideas that have led to the systems that we have today. And when you put these things together in combination with technology, culture, economics, and law, you end up with catastrophic externalities. And so we have to understand how those things are happening and push in the right direction. So these aren't just ideas, right? They get codified into like these really solid things around us, right? The way our elections work, the way our policies work, the way our laws work, the way our technology works, the actual thing we hold in our hands, and the actual way that product interacts with our brain. What does it make us do? What does it try to not just to do? So related to tech, you may have heard some of these things, right? These are some of the most common things that come up, like give users what they want. Technology is neutral. Like there's some good things, there's some bad things. Like, it's not my problem to figure it out. I just build tech. We've always panicked about new technologies, right? And so I think this generation of technology, the latest ones, have been very different because they have an agenda, which is very different. They're much more closely tied to the business models and the kind of infinite growth economic incentives. So there's a lot, they're really different and they interact much more closely with the mind than previous technologies. And they change themselves, right? They're adaptive, especially the AI powered ones, they're adaptive and they learn. there's a lot of things that are different from something passive like TV or even like older video games or radio. Personalization, right? Just personalize everything, and that's going to be the best experience, and that's what's best for society. Who are we to choose? It's really hard to be ethical, like, so we'll talk about all of these things. And in a lot of ways, the course is debunking these myths. I'll explain that one in a little while. Grow at all costs, right? Growth is the thing that we're all aiming for. We must grow, grow, grow all the time. Obsessing over metrics, right? That's what's going to help us grow, right? Grow the best ways, like measure everything and make sure everything is going up, up, up. Capture attention, right? Attention is sort of this fundamental currency. So like, let's capture as much attention as we can, and that's going to help drive growth. So we want to move from this extractive paradigm to a more humane paradigm. And that's what this course is really about. I'll show you also, this is like when you want to change a system, right? If you want to build technology that's more aligned with humanity, and you need designers, engineers, leaders, shareholders, governments, all to build this kind of technology, how do you get there? I'm going to go through this very quickly. We can come back and discuss some more at the end, but you have to start with thought leadership, right? You have to set an agenda. You have to have the right language and ideas. So this kind of presentation tries to help to organize all of the efforts underneath. So under that, there's external pressure, right? So this is sort of adding penalties, right? Because capitalism is centered on price. So you have to make moves that affect price. So either you have to say, okay, you have to shift supply or demand, or you have to bring in externalities, right? External costs that are invisible, that aren't on the balance sheets, bring them back to price. So there are different ways to do that. And so this, you can put pressure through media, right? Like the social dilemma helped a lot of people to understand the problem, but it also created pressure. And it created a way for politicians and technology insiders and parents all to talk about the same issues with the same language. So there's different ways you can do this, right? With media, with policy, with education, in schools. You can work with insiders, right? So you can do things like this course. You can give workshops, which we do. You can advise tech companies. There's, they have their incentives, but there are some things they can change. And so we try to work on that, and connect people, right? You can build community, you can build solutions libraries and other resources. So when you put all this together, this is sort of the work of Center for Humane Technology. Again, we can talk much more about all that. All of this, we talk about various parts of all of this in the course, right? This we go into great detail. This is a model that is more specific for technology. So Dr. Donella Meadows, right? She had this essay called 12 Leverage Points to Intervene in a System. You should read that essay if you're interested in systems change work. It's really, really good. It's very concise. So this model is sort of the analog of that for the kind of tech industry, extractive tech ecosystem. And in the course, you walk through each one of these levers. But the point is, there are a lot of different ways to intervene, and we have to understand them and understand the trade-offs and examples for each of them, so we can make the right decisions and push in the right areas. Sometimes it's not necessarily true that you want to push further out all the time, because the ones further out are also harder. So there are some trade-offs, right? So sometimes you might want to make a simple design change, like reducing friction in the system or changing how virality works in the system. And that can have huge positive impact on the platform. And in contrast, changing the whole paradigm can be really hard, right? Because people don't like to always change their ways of thinking. It's a lot of work. So basically, we need to shift from this cycle, this broken cycle of humane technology driving, kind of downgrading us, right? Our minds and our culture, our values, which then sows distrust and degrades our institutions, which means the institutions can't look after, right, the laws and the rules that are needed for technology to actually operate in alignment with humanity. So we have to flip to this, right? A world of more humane technology that's more nuanced, more balanced, and it makes us more nuanced and balanced, upgrades our institutions, and that's a much more positive cycle. We have a lot of complex problems, right, to solve, as you know very well. But our technology right now is kind of downgrading us. And so we have this wisdom gap that's actually been growing in the last decades, which kind of sucks, right? This is a big problem because our problems are getting bigger as well. So another way of thinking of this is that democracies and collaborative problem solving rely on two key faculties. One is sense making. So this is how we make sense of the world and reality, right? All this information around us, how do we make sense of it in our head? And the second thing is how we make choices, right? This is like decision making, choice making. How do we make wise choices based on what this information that we've gathered? So the problem is these faculties are increasingly mediated by our technology. And when that technology is tied to an infinite growth economy, business models, CEOs, shareholders, right? They're all accountable to this like infinite growth model. That doesn't work well, as we all know. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about, so these are just sort of some highlights of the biggest topics in the course. So I'm going to talk a little bit about thriving in values. So let's just pause for a moment. What does thriving, happiness, flourishing, what does that mean to you? And just put your answers in the chat. Imagine a thriving world locally and globally. How does your work kind of fit into that? Just pause for like just 30 seconds and just feel free to put in your thoughts in the chat. I'm going to take a look. And I'm sorry, I'm going a little bit fast. There's just a lot that I really wanted to cover here. So again, you can go through the course content to dive in deep.
Randy, just quickly coming in here because I think people can only, not everyone can see the answers. So I thought maybe let's read out a few as inspiration.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, so we have motivation at 100%, meeting the needs of others, mental health, honest conversations, learning, listening, connecting with the local community and nature. And now everyone feature seems to be enabled. So we have minimizing pain and the opportunity to maximize happiness for as many as possible. Satisfied folks, very nice, very simple happiness. Less for charity, everyone benefits from progress, not just a few. So lots of inspiration coming your way, Randy. Back to you.
Yeah, I really like this one. Thriving is a circular ecosystem that leaves no one behind. I think that's an important piece of it. And then of course, like the happiness pieces. So let's talk about that. Like, what does that mean, right? When we talk about thriving, we start by saying what thriving is not, because people get really confused about it and they have a lot of wrong ideas. It's not an endpoint. It's not something, when we get to it, we're done, right? It's kind of it's going to be continuous. It's a direction and a process. It's certainly not distracted downtime, right? We do need rest, but hyperstimulation that leaves us dazed and overwhelmed is not the goal. It's not something you deliver, right? It's conditions that are put in place that allow users to experience that, and it happens over a lifetime. It's a continuous process. Definitely not quick hits of dopamine and short-term pleasure. So again, hyperstimulation is a big problem. We'll talk more about that. But then when you get to addiction, like everything goes wrong after that. The deepest point is thriving is not about, it's not the absence of pain or loss. There's always going to be unknowns. There's always going to be difficulties. There's always going to be, sickness, old age. People are going to pass away. There's stuff like that that's going to happen. So the question is, thriving is about approaching those things with wisdom. So how do we do that, and how do we gain wisdom through those experiences, right? That's what we're really aiming for. The course goes as a whole module on this, and I highly recommend, I think this is the one you should do after the first module, do this one. This is the 7th module, but this is really, really important. So I'll just touch on these very quickly, right? So balanced relationship between pleasure, pain, and meaning. Gratitude, creativity, and learning. These are all kind of traditional, I'd say more Western concepts that are really good, right? They're just like, they're spacious, they're generally selfless, especially when they're done in service of something, but they're not strongly egoic, and I think that's really good. Balancing and respecting the flows of life. So this is again being in accordance with what your body needs, what the world needs, right? What people need. Not being compulsive, right? Not stringing people along with this idea that if you just do this, your life will finally be good, right? This is like the common marketing game, right? So we don't want to get into that. We certainly don't want to drain, exhaust, or overwhelm people, because when we're in those states, we're not able to do all of the other things that make us better people. Acceptance is really important. I'll talk a little bit about that. And I mean, basically, so, acceptance, I think I'll talk about it now. So acceptance is really important because it's this idea that I think all of the major religions sort of get you there, right? In understanding that, yeah, there's all these ups and downs, but the way we respond is the key thing. And the current moment, you can't change it, right? It just is how it is. And so you have to be able to accept that while saying, okay, well, in the future, I want to make these changes, right? There's things I'm going to do. But if your mind is constantly resisting, right, this moment, then you're constantly unhappy. So I think this is a really important point. Care and kindness is often not talked about enough when it comes to technology. Somehow, like, that gets left behind, and we get into this world of growth and productivity and optimization. But to be kind, we need to not be overloaded. We need to have the mental space and energy. We need to focus on whole people, not just metrics. So when we reduce people and anything like trees or anything, when we reduce them to simple metrics, we lose all of the beauty, right? The beauty of the complexity of a tree or of a person. So just like a tree looks after its whole ecosystem, right? It's not just lumber, right? It's like it's a home for animals. It helps to address erosion. It puts oxygen in the air. There are all kinds of beautiful things that we lose when we reduce it to how many pieces of lumber are in that tree. And our minds are no different. We need to find opportunities to be kind and repeat that often, right? To become more kind. Quality relationships, right? The interactions between people. This is one of the things that really nourishes us. And then reducing regret, right? So looking back at past actions and saying, what's the distance between those actions and where we wanted to be, right? That's kind of regret. So that's one way of looking at trying to build technology that's like more thriving aligned. Is it probably has lower regret metrics. That's one of those few metrics that actually works pretty well as a single value metric. And then as someone said in the chat, thriving systems, right? So Kate Rayworth, we did a full podcast episode on this. This idea of a donut economy, right? Where inside there's some basic foundation that you need to have. If you have too little, you don't meet that foundation. And so there's a fair amount of space where we can do well, right? People can be healthy, our ecosystems can be healthy. But of course, when we try to do this infinite growth thing, you run into all of these problems. You over extract from the resources you depend on, and then everything breaks. And this idea, it's kind of crazy that we think that we can extract and grow infinitely without cost, because there's always a cost, right? And she talks a lot about this. So we'll talk a little more about it in a bit. But our ideas of thriving have to align with the Earth's ecological ceilings and our own needs, humans' needs, and the needs of others, not just individuals. So let's talk a little bit about values, right? So based on our definition of values, we have our definition of thriving. We each hold specific values that guide our behavior. So for example, you might value honesty, safety, relationships. But because all of these things are influenced by our life circumstances, it means we can't be neutral. We're not neutral, we can't be neutral. Every decision is influenced by these conditions. So when we build technology, right, it means the choices that we show in the order that we show, the recommendations that we give, the defaults that we set, all of these are conditioned, right, by our own minds and what we think is right and wrong, which is kind of illustrates, right, it comes out of our definition of thriving. So we go through this in detail in the course, right? How our values are encoded in the products, society's values and structure shape the products. When we drop a product into this water, right, of society, if the water is poisoned, the product gets poisoned too. And of course, all of the interactions we have with products, the products change us too. So then when we build products, right, our minds are influenced by the products that we use, which then changes the way that we look at the next generation of choices. And a good example of this is like, let's say TikTok and shorter videos. If we ourselves are watching these shorter and shorter videos, our standards for what's entertaining or like what's appropriate will change. So the next time we'll make a decision that's probably in the direction of a shorter and shorter video, and you end up in this horrible cycle. Yeah, so these are the kinds of things. Like, it's really important to look at how a product interaction actually is conditioning, right, the minds of users. So how is a product nudging behavior, affecting attention, altering values, people's values, adults' values, and children's values, training us for instant gratification, making us less resilient, putting us in races against each other, right? So like parents competing to share their kid pictures, people competing on LinkedIn to like humbly brag about the things that they've accomplished. Not to mention media, journalists, like everybody's in competition, right? So, and the social media companies themselves, the AI companies themselves, everyone's in these races. So just a quick distinction on values. Values guide us about how we behave, right? How we speak or act. They're derived from thriving. That's different from cultural norms, right? Which are behaviors that we may consider important, not because we necessarily believe in them so deeply, but because others do them. So if we follow norms, it's probably because we care about something else, which is like community or relationships. So distinguishing between values and norms and goals, which are actually endpoints, is really important. And again, as you all know, right, values, thriving, all of these things vary widely by culture. So in the course, we tried to take a kind of an expansive view of thriving, which I think is important in a global world. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure, right? So this is what happens, is we have thriving, we have values. Based on those values, we set up some metrics, right? To know, are we doing well or are we not doing well, right? Everyone does this. But we have to be really careful, because when we do A/B testing and we optimize, right, normally based on things like revenue, users, time spent, these are helpful when you have these really giant systems, but also they can amplify and mask harms. Again, we go through all of the different ways this can happen in the course, but just wanted to bring this. I think it's important to be aware. So next thing is this idea of, this is just an important kind of equation. It's approximate, right? Competition and extraction, which are sort of the basis of capitalism, right? Capitalism is really based on competition, but when you compete, to have an edge, you tend to want to extract, right? Extract something. So when you extract resources, and those can be natural resources, but those can also be human, right? Like our attention. You can compete better. So the better you get at doing that, the better you can compete, and the more you win in the marketplace. When we exponentiate these things with technology, then we have a big problem. And we end up breaking, right? We end up extracting from the resources too much. We extract beyond what's healthy, and then our actual ecosystems, and even, right, our mind, right, the ecosystem of our brain, that stuff all breaks down. So existential risk happens when the rules of the game can't keep up. And back to this, right? This is the problem. The rules that we set can't keep up with the godlike technology. And of course, our emotions are even further behind, right? They're very easy to manipulate. There's another concept called multipolar trap. So this is the idea where everyone engages in harmful behavior, not because they want to, but because they'll lose if they don't, right? So the example here is like, if you have seafood companies extracting from a fishery, even though they're extracting so fast that the fishery is going to collapse, each one of them can't stop, right? Because if they stop, the others will be like, oh, cool, more fish for me. When actually the best thing to do is for all of them to pause for a while and let the fish regenerate, and then they can continue. Same thing happens with social media, right? So the race for shorter and shorter videos is a good example, where like if one company doesn't do it, the next one will, and they'll get more users because the short addictive videos are very effective, right, at keeping people on site and clicking. So these are the examples. And so we talk a little bit about how to escape them, right? So you can band together and change the rules. You can improve transparency. You can use combinations of consumer awareness, legislation, litigation, design changes. Certain kinds of collaboration, regulation are all like part of this equation. But recognizing this pattern is really important. It's also trivial because it's everywhere. Everywhere you look, you'll see this pattern, especially in capitalist economies. So this is just kind of an important thing to be aware of and to design for. So in the course, we have things like, this is an example of a rubric that helps assess externalities of technology. So I won't go into it here, but just know that it's in there. This is in module 3. The last thing I wanted to mention on this topic is less is more, right? Everyone forgets about this, right? Because of these underlying, I mean everyone in the Western paradigm, right? Because it's like one of the fundamental tenets is growth is good. So it's really hard for the mind to think about, wait a minute, sometimes like doing less is the way to do it, right? And of course, there's economic reasons why that happens, because when you have a system and you have a set of externalities around that system, it's economically valuable, right, to address those externalities. But often the solution ends up generating more externalities at an even bigger level. So each time you're going out, monetizing that set of externalities, and then you move out again, right? So you kind of keep doing that. And that doesn't work very well. So the thing to do, the sustainable regenerative answer is often to do less, right? So regenerative healthy lifestyles are better than investing in new drugs. Energy efficiency programs are better than building more and more energy, right? For example, with technology, sliding scale subscription removes you from this idea, this kind of this need to have engagement maximizing algorithms all the time, right, that are creating addiction. So this is really important, right? Reducing the scale of activity allows some kind of regeneration to happen, allows us to get healthy ecosystems and our own minds. And the last thing I wanted to mention is, this is kind of an obvious point, but I think, again, this is forgotten a lot when it comes to technology. Our evolutionary conditioning has developed over millions of years, right? So we have these cognitive shortcuts, heuristics that help us to make decisions faster. And generally, those have helped to keep us alive, healthy, and reproducing, right? This is kind of the evolutionary support. But they're also very easily hijacked, right? Especially by our technology. And like there's a whole set of cognitive biases that we have. And so we need our technology to be actually aligned with that, right? To understand how to use those to maybe to nudge us to do healthier things, like say maybe exercise more or read something skillful. But we can also use it very easily to be distracted, right? So I think this is just a quick point. And to give you some ideas of what that could look like, right? So here, imagine if before you use something, before you use an app, you set your intention before you start. Set dosage limits. And this is an interesting idea. You could do intermittent slowdowns when you're scrolling continuously. It could start to slow down in a sort of a jerky way, which the mind does not like. So that's a good example of tapping into an evolutionary process that can be used in our favor, right? So another example, how many times have you unlocked your phone? If you saw that on the screen, you might hesitate, right? You probably would, right? From unlocking it yet again. Matching the number of relationships on a platform to human limits. We don't do this very often. And a lot of times actually platforms are trying to have you be in relationship with hundreds or thousands of people, which is kind of stupid, right? It just doesn't match with the way that it's not what's healthy for us. And it leads to all these downstream harms because you get performative behavior, like all kinds of bad things happen when you're on a stage with a megaphone, right, and everyone's on the same stage with megaphones trying to yell at each other. It's not a good model. Wind down features, like at the end of the day, right? Ways to actually slow down before you go to sleep. These are all examples of things that are aligned, right, with human nature. So we need to do that more often. We have this rubric. I'm not going to go into detail here, but in the course, right, we have a rubric that basically guides people through. If you want to basically run a product through a checklist, here it is. So I think this is really helpful. So just wanted you to be aware of that. And that's it. So there's just some highlights of the course so we can talk a little bit about logistics. I'm happy to do Q&A and to stay on a little bit extra because I'm sure there's a lot of those. One thing I'd like to know in the chat, if you can just put how you think this information in this course, like what impact will it allow you to have? What changes? What do you think you'll be able to do as a result of this information and if you're going to take the course, taking the course. So please put that in the chat if you get a chance. Okay, thank you all. I'll stop the share.
Stop the share, and while we're giving you a little break and while colleagues are thinking about what to put on the course, I'm in the chat, I'm also going to launch a little poll because we're obviously curious if we've enticed you to take the course. So tell us, Randy's done a good job, and if you're curious. Foreshadowing, several of you have already reached out to me saying you're definitely going to want to drop Randy a line and you're definitely going to want to take the course. Randy, it's been really interesting to hear about, this principled mindset that we need to adopt when we're thinking about designing technologies, about interacting with technologies. You promised it would be an interesting presentation, and I want to say you've definitely delivered. Very curious to hear what questions are going to be coming in.
Me too. I'm also curious in the poll. I'm very interested. For the maybes, like what is it that makes it maybe? Like what could be done to make it not maybe? If you can put that in the chat, that would be really interesting too.
That's right, because Randy can already see that about 30% of colleagues said maybe to, are you interested in taking the course as a cohort? 70% said yes, and we have 3% saying no, we're not going to investigate that. So very, very curious to hear that, and good to see there's interest. I have a bunch of questions that come in for you, Randy, and I'm going to try and give the floor to Patricia from UNHCR New York, I believe. Patricia, I'm going to unmute you. If you want to take the floor to ask the question yourself, you're welcome to do so now.
Okay, thank you, Joanna, and thank you, Randy, for the presentation. It was really, really fascinating, and definitely going to be taking the course just to have a more holistic perspective, maybe on technology. I think at the UN we get often caught up in the processes, and that would be kind of a good, a good perspective to have while we do that. But yes, my question was, where do you see the UN's role as an international actor, maybe a medieval institution, if we use it based on your presentation, in changing today's tech paradigm? And more generally speaking, what do you need to focus on when promote human technology in the near future? And maybe if you have any ideas of challenges that you think we should be mindful of when moving the tech sector towards this change. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is a tough one. I mean, this is actually one I don't like to turn questions back, but I think this is really one for you all to contemplate. I think it's a very UN specific question, but what I would say, I can predict some of the problems you'll run into, right? Which is that these systems are so strong, right, that it's very hard to displace them. So what I would do is do this mapping exercise. So going back to, if I can, actually, let me just share that. I want to go back to this slide. Oh, it's a long way back. So let me actually do this. If you remember this slide, this one, you're seeing this, right? The big diagram.
Yeah.
This one is a really good framework for how, like, what do we, how do we handle this? I think you have to think along these lines. Oh no, yeah. And look at where there's leverage. Every country is going to be different, right? With the technology companies. I mean, we put a lot of effort into the companies themselves because they're the power. This is one of these interesting problems where, like, unlike climate, the power here and the sort of the causes of the challenges are very localized, right? They're all concentrated in a very small set of geographies. Um, Climate is a sort of much harder sort of global challenge, right? But this problem of technology downgrading us is making it hard to solve all of the other problems, including climate. But anyway, so I think isolating where depending on the countries that you work with, and the areas of expertise you have, I would look at this diagram and say, okay, well, where can I apply leverage? So for example, some things that are coming to mind that we could do is, if you have people who should listen to this talk, right? Who should listen to this talk or take the course, we can do another session that's like all of those people, right? Which should be like a very, very large group, and to kind of have an amplified effect. Like affecting their thinking is one of the valuable things we can do. And I think you can think of the UN as a very powerful distribution network for these kinds of ideas. And then figuring out on the ground, like what's the right move, I think has to be very carefully mapped. But I would do it like this. I would think of it as a systems change problem. You have to identify the powerful nodes in the system, have relationships with them, change their thinking, change the mindset, right? So going back to this, I think, yeah, this one, right? Changing from, how many people say, oh, technology is just neutral, like changing all that stuff and just like getting it out of the head and putting some new ideas in the head is how this can be done. It's really hard. We're talking about a very difficult problem, but I think we have some access and we can't not do it. So we have to try.
Thanks, Randy. Resonates very well. Hope we answered we started to answer your question, Patricia. I've seen some comments in the Q&A box around technology not just being neutral, but sometimes even disadvantaging certain population groups. Gender was mentioned, but I'm sure we can mention several others there as well. Randy, your question around why people might only maybe want to take the course, I thought I'd give some quick feedback from the chat, and people were saying courses actually are quite a big time commitment, and often colleagues don't have enough time to do it. They feel kind of overworked already in their context, and if courses aren't linked to performance deliverables, then it can sometimes be a little bit hard to follow up on that. So that was the feedback I read a few times there. But I want to give the floor to our colleague Hilary from the Youth Envoys Office, who's actually very interested in taking the course and potentially bringing it to other colleagues. Hilary, welcome to the webinar. Your question.
For organizing this, and thank you, Randy, for the presentation. I think is really great. Just I guess quickly from my end, I shared my question in the chat. Like we've seen, especially now in the UN space as well, there's more and more pressure on in terms of bringing changes into tech policies and governance. We see a lot of initiatives running on that as well with the Global Digital Compact. However, in past experience engaging, for instance, industry leaders in terms of, or technology industry leaders, a lot of these changes on policies are not always reflected in their product pipeline. So I guess in your experience, how do we address this gap? And then also taking into account, a lot of the tech pipeline and their development is really much responding to the market demand. And I guess it also relates to some of the examples that you were sharing, that if we're getting so used to in the way we consume technologies, it becomes a standard, and hence pushing more demand for the technology to go towards that way. In addition to that question in addressing the gap, I guess I'm also interested in learning your point of view in terms of how do we mainstream the concept of stewardship in technology, so that we can leverage technology, we can leverage the concept of bringing human-centric technology and then technology use as a vehicle for good, also from people who are actually working on developing this. I think it would be interested to learning your thoughts on that.
Okay, a lot in there. I think the short answer for the first question, which is okay, policies are enacted, but they have to be enforced. And I think this is where a lot of policy, kind of comes back to EU and US, and sometimes the US states, because those are the places with the big sticks, right? That can actually enforce. And when you have a multi-$100 billion company, penalties that affect you have to be in the tens or higher billion-dollar range, right? Otherwise, it just doesn't matter. So this is where I do think kind of litigation and enforcement are an important part of that process, right? And so you have to not only set the laws, but you have to enforce them, and you have to have kind of commensurate penalties. And then stewardship, yeah, I think having more technologists have this kind of global view, this is one of the things we try to help with. And I think doing these kinds of trainings at scales, giving workshops and trainings inside tech companies, that's a really efficient way to do it, right? Because if you can find the right groups and companies, like that's something they need to just understand. And there are a lot of really good people who want to have a more stewardship kind of view, more holistic, more ecosystem friendly, like the whole ecosystem, natural ecosystem. And everyone is concerned about climate, right? More and more now. And this is why I put the wildfire picture first in the presentation, because many of the technologists are most directly affected by the wildfire one, right? Because a lot of them live in California. So try to think about those kinds of things, like where it meets for them. And of course, thinking about like their children and the future that's ahead is pretty important. So, but it's hard. I think that's a tough task. This is our collective task, right? So I think part of why we have this kind of presentation is to ask the question, how can we use like the network, the innovation network, UNDP, how can we use those as ways to get these ideas to more people who are in influential positions, right, in these ecosystems? That's how we're going to make things change. It's one of the pieces. There is no, like I said, that's why I keep this diagram up, just to remember, there is no one piece. There's no one easy answer. But the blue box, right, when more and more people understand it, more and more people are using the right language, it gives you a better chance to get all of the downstream things done. Also, I just want to address, so this thing about course time, absolutely, I agree. I think this is always a challenge. If you're in that group who doesn't have as much time, just do the slides, right? There's a slide version, just page down through them. It's better than not doing it at all. And that won't take you very long at all. I don't recommend it because I think you'll get a lot less out of it. But if the choice is between zero and doing it, I would definitely do it and just page down through quickly all of the different slides. And stuff just skip through. You'll see a lot of things. Everyone has different expertise, right? So some people, you'll find the areas that you don't know, spend a little time, read those, and then flip through the rest quickly. That's what I recommend.
Thanks for clarifying, Randy. And I think taking courses is a little bit easier and maybe a little bit more fun if you do it together. So we are hoping to launch a cohort of UN innovation colleagues interested in taking this course. As we mentioned at the beginning, if we get a big group together, we might be able to introduce one or two more interactive points with the colleagues from the Center for Humane Technology. So sign up using your UN email address, and then we'll try and do this peer learning. We can also think about organizing discussion sessions around it. So very open to supporting the learning and making it a little bit easier for colleagues to carry on in busy days. Randy, I've got another question. We seem to have a lot of New York questions. You said you can run over a little.
Yeah, I don't mind. This is really important. This is like the part where the ideas, meet the presentation meets the brains, right? So it's really important.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So I'm going to go to Kat from our Development Coordination Office, and then Courtney, I see you in Rome. So please don't log off yet. Kat, over to you for your question on sense making.
Hi, Randy. Thanks so much for the presentation. This was awesome. I love that this is introducing a bit of balance and sort of on the need to have discussions around sort of generating wisdom. And I feel like that's something that we don't have a process for in the UN. we have strategy, we have planning,
Right.
programming, but what is that process for reflection and generation of wisdom? That's my question about sense making. So what does this look like in an organization that is doing this well, doing this functionally, that has a governance structure around it? Something we're also sort of genuflecting about inside the UN. We have a group that is thinking about a lot of the obligations set out in front of our common agenda, which was this sort of recent sort of vision from our Secretary General about what is the UN that is fit for purpose in the 21st century, what should we be working on, what are those system transformations, et cetera. So part of that is thinking about this institution in terms of its duties to future generations and how we introduce that principle or those principles into our strategy design, into our programming design. And in the process of reflecting on this, we've realized that it's not just about talking the rhetoric about its systems change and duties to the future, but actually creating governance structures around that. So there's some sort of way that we do regular reflection and sense making between ourselves, what we're doing, and the changing environment and the changing future. So where have you seen this done well, and what could you advise us over?
Yeah, this is a really great question. I think this is the heart of it. I mean, this is a good sort of, if there's a way to elevate this with leadership, I think this is the question, right? This is kind of, because it's sort of the blue box for the UN, right? When we look at this same diagram and say, okay, well, how do we make the blue box happen? So a few thoughts. I think definitely having a systems change view is really, really important, right? Understanding incentives and the alignment of incentives. And so someone actually answered, there was a good point, right, in the course. They said, hey, we're not rewarded for learning. We're not rewarded for taking a course. Okay, so that's a problem, right? Like there should be, again, it's a world of shoulds, but this is kind of what we have to get to. And I think it's my job to give the shoulds. So I'll say it. I think there should be alignment where there's actually a portion of your time. So at CHT, for example, we've carved out time on Fridays to learn, right? I spend quite a lot of my time learning. I think it's really important, right, to be well educated in a world that's changing fast. So one is incentives for learning, for bringing up problems, for diving into material and expanding your mind, like has to be, right? It should be in your performance review. I mean, this person learned, this person. So one thing we do is we're just trying to do this better at CHT is everyone spend some time learning and then report on the things you learned, share it with the other people, right? Isn't that great? Rather than everyone doing the same thing, let's all do different things and then share the highlights, things like that, right? Those are good systems changes, processes. I think you have to have good probes in the system, to listen to, like, with these complex systems, right? The things that are changing in ways you can't always understand. You have to have good ways of listening to the system. And so I think that's a really important piece, right? Do you have good feedback loops built into the processes? Yeah, and then I think, internal change. This is the last thing, is you mentioned this, right? With reflections, internal change, because in the end, this is about changing like our own internal compass, right? Like the guidance, and I think people end up centered sometimes on the wrong problems, right? And that's just because of what they've been told or what they've been taught or whatever. There's lots of reasons, but it's easy to get stuck on the thing that's just not going to do it. It's not going to get the job done, because you can see that as soon as you implement that, the bigger thing's going to eat that up. So it still might be okay to do that, but you should at least be really aware and have the full conversation about, well, what's going to happen, right? What are again, back to dominant forces. I think identifying those is really, really important. So yeah, just some thoughts. This is a complex question. Just going to get some water. Just 1 second, please. You can read the next question.
Sure, very happy to. And sorry, we're giving you tough questions pre-coffee, Randy, but again, appreciate you being with us and even staying a few minutes longer. Kat, I hope we answered your question. And we're going to go to Courtney in Rome at FAO. Courtney, welcome. And I had a feeling when I saw behavioral science pop up that you might be coming in to say a few words.
Am I that predictable, Johanna? Thanks so much for fielding the question. And Randy, thank you so much for sharing these insights, Joanna, for organizing. This is really fascinating stuff. And as I couldn't help but comment probably too much, it's really, I mean, the first thing I see is this context matters concept described in a humanist way and described from a value-centered approach. And it's really refreshing and interesting, and I think we could learn a lot from it. I guess my question, which was intended to start conversation, not necessarily contradict, but rather you mentioned heuristics and biases. You talk about the limitations of human cognition, but yet a lot of what I, of course, from my very limited understanding of your paradigm, rests on changing thinking, on shifting values, on very high level concepts that, from a behavioral perspective, constantly fall short of achieving behavioral barriers. So I guess it's around, how does this course help people make the desired behavior easier through designing through context? Because you want to make the technology make the desired behavior easier so it's more humane, but in order to get the change makers to actually do that themselves, it can't be such a hard, burdensome ask, and it can't go against the context. So that's the that's the question I have, and thanks again for sharing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is the challenge, right? Because what you find, I think, throughout, you'll find this, I think, probably at the UN too, right? Where there's a group of people, normally they'll be lower down, who are like really aligned. As you go up, the alignment starts to be like, or like, we want to do it, but we can't, right? This kind of thing. And at tech companies, it's very common because the accountability to the business model rises as you go up, right? The UN should be more free of this, right? There should be a pretty clean structure, but there's still some challenges that come up even in sort of an NGO style setup, because they're still old, like old thinking, old goals, right? Things that have to be done, right? Metrics that have to be achieved that were, that may not be as holistic. I see this as kind of a gradual process. I think so. In the course specifically, there are reflection questions in each module to help address this, right? To kind of help you connect your mind with what you've read and like internalize some of the concepts. There's more to be done. In fact, we're building out some more along those lines, because I think there's a whole internal compass changing thing. That's a big process. I think that the challenge I think all course deliverers run up against is the time, right? Like to do real internal change takes time, and already like time is always at a premium. So how do we do that effectively? I think these are the questions we're always looking at and talking to different people and saying, well, how do you do it? We picked a trade-off that's kind of balanced of information, reflection, but we could have more reflections, it's a tough one. I do believe in, like, I think one of the big mistakes that people make sometimes is they say, wow, like I'm not saying you're doing this, I'm just saying it happens a lot, where they see a goal, like the things we have to change are quite profound. So then you look at that and say, well, that seems impossible, so I'm just going to keep doing like the thing I'm doing, right? Because it's really hard. But a different way, I think a better way of thinking of it is saying, well, every step forward is a good step. And if we don't take any steps, we're never going to get there, right? So at least, but let's make sure that the steps we take are actually in the right direction. So that's why this kind of talk, what we're trying to do is to say, okay, are we pointing in the right direction? So that when we start walking, we're kind of walking in the right direction. Because I think there are a lot of steps to go the wrong way very, very easily. Also, just to address your point, your question, just about sort of equity. So we have a whole module on fairness and justice that covers these topics. There's a lot here, right, about technology has not been good. And it is insane, right, that like women are treated as a special case in a lot of situations with technology. So we touch on all of that in fairness and justice, the 6th module.
That's really good to hear, Randy. Nigina, our colleague from UNEP PA, will be pleased to hear that. It is a really important topic, and I'm glad there's a whole module dedicated to that. Randy, we've gone over 10 minutes. maybe just one last question, or maybe a
Yeah,
double
sure.
one.
Let's do 5 more minutes, and then we can wrap it at 15. Yeah.
That sounds great. That I'll throw it you. And actually, taking moderator privileges, I'd actually be curious, what scares you the most and what excites you the most? So where do you see this going in a doomsday scenario, and where do you hope, what's the direction that you hope we're going to pivot in and all march ahead? Sorry.
I don't feel so good about where things are going because, again, when you look at the dominant forces, it's very clear. In some ways, AI, right, the advancement of large language models in particular, right, so like ChatGPT and GPT-4, and now, Microsoft's integrating it with search, and Google will do that. And that may be the tipping point that had to happen, right, where it's sort of like, oh, okay, at one point there were these conversations and saying, oh, okay, like truck drivers are going to be the first to be automated, or like, early on. And now it's like, oh, okay, all cognitive, like a lot of cognitive roles are going to be automated. The arts, right, creativity, right, there's real impact on all of these things. So I think that's really profound. So it's bringing us to a moment of, I don't know, crisis, right? But like really, like the rubber has met the road now, and this is going to be very, very different from anything before, right? Like, and so conversations about universal basic income as an example, right? Like, but just ways to handle a situation where millions, like literally millions and like billions of people will be put out of work very quickly. We're going to have to solve that, right? So in some ways, like that's the you can see I'm not optimistic about it, but like that's the good side of it happening, right? And there's some other nice things, right? Like imagine, I love the fact that people in Sri Lanka, right? Like, so my parents, I showed them ChatGPT, and they can like mess around with it, right? This is really important, right? So it's important for anyone who doesn't have highly educated parents or whatever, right? So as an example, for kids in school, like if you have questions about your homework, you can actually, it's not fully reliable. ChatGPT is not fully reliable for these things, but things will be. Don't look at where we are, look at where we're going to be. I think that's a really important thing. There's a tendency where people see technologies like ChatGPT and say, look, I broke it in this way. And it's like, yeah, that's going to be fixed for sure, right? Because that technology is pretty old now in AI terms. So that part is really nice. It makes me feel good when I think about more people getting access to these kinds of technologies, knowledge, cognitive power, and you can really learn with it, right? You can ask questions and sort of debate and improve your understanding. That's beautiful. But again, it's sort of like you have to look at the trend. Where's the concentration of power? Who owns the technology? What's going to happen to the vast numbers of people, right? As the automation, like every company is always going to automate. When they're given the choice, they're always going to automate. Why? Because it's cost effective. Humans are really expensive, and they get sick and they get angry, right? They get overworked. They get sad, right? They have emotions. And so like there's just so much more work. Every time you can automate, you're going to choose to automate. This is our problem. And like, I don't know how anyone can argue with that. That is like, that's what's going to happen. That's what's already happened. That's what's going to continue to happen. And it's going to happen very fast. So I think this is a big thing to take away. And this is why, again, you come back to these principles, right? So how does it all tie in? In a world where all these things are changing so fast, it's more important than ever that you go back to like, what are the trends? Why are we doing all this stuff? Like, so thriving, happiness, right? Like, what does that world look like? You better have a vision of that. And it better not be naive, right? It has to be like not something simplistic. It has to be complex. And then what are the values that derive from that? What are the metrics that derive from that? How do we handle that, right? So all these conversations, how do we respect human nature? How do we address the incentive structures and the economic systems? Like, you have to have all of that together.
It's not going to be easy. One could be a little bit pessimistic hearing that, but I like the circle that you've taken back to thriving. What we saw in the chat there and what you mentioned are some beautiful things that give us energy, does make us thrive. So let's focus back on these and work towards these. And as I said, I really like your approach of having a principled mindset to help us get there. And it's good that there's a course available that can help us learn this in a fast pace, in a slow pace, as a cohort.
That's right.
So in any way of that we have time for, there is a learning module available for you. And we hope we've inspired many of you on the call to go and take the course and come back and tell us what you thought and have more discussions with Randy, colleagues, and myself about this. And with that, Randy, I'm going to say thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's been a really interesting presentation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I've definitely learned something new. I hope colleagues on the call have as well. We appreciate you taking the time, and we hope to be seeing you in future in one of the webinars. Thank you so very much.
All right, folks. Thank you all. Thank you all for your showing up in your different time zones. I know everything's represented. So thanks very much.